Good evening. My name is Raheem Thompson. I'm the manager of public programs. Thank you for joining us tonight for what will be a great discussion between Rick Solomon, our vice president for board of directors, and New York Times bestselling author David Nassau as they talk about his latest book, The Last Million: Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War. At the end of World War II, there were a myriad amount of people left starving and homeless. Allied prisoners of war, Jewish survivors of concentration camps, and forced laborers from conquered lands were all part of this group. Over time, most of them were able to return to their homelands. However, there were a large group of people who refused to return or had no home to return to. This group is known as the last million, which will be the focal point of tonight's discussion. But before I pass things off to Rick, I would like to thank all of our community partners, and I would like to thank everyone in attendance tonight. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy tonight's program.
Thank you,
Thank
Raheem, for the introduction. And thank you, David, for writing this outstanding book, which I have here with us. So let's get right into it. You've written books on a host of subjects: Joseph P. Kennedy, Andrew Carnegie, William Randolph Hearst. Tell us about the genesis of this book and its searching research.
Let me begin by thanking you and the Illinois Holocaust Museum for this opportunity to talk about my book. It's very difficult for me, even at this stage, though I've been asked this question many times, to figure out exactly how this came about. What I do know is that, let me quote from a public historian at the University of Manchester. His name is David Olusoga. He's a Nigerian English historian. And he's written, quote, "We look to history for warm baths to feel comfortable about our past. Facts struggle when they are up against myths that are so potent. The myth which I fought against, and the myth which I needed to write a book to put the facts out there and destroy the myth, was that when World War II was over, the United States of America, the White House, the Senate, the Congress, opened their doors to the Jewish survivors and said, we know we have not done enough for you during the war itself. But our first priority, as Franklin Roosevelt always said, was to win the war. And we know that 6 million have died. But the war is over now. Welcome. I discovered, almost by accident, by reading many, many Holocaust memoirs, by interviewing people, because I have friends who are the children of Holocaust survivors, that they didn't arrive in the United States till 1949, 1950, 1951. The question was why? Where were they for those 3 to 5 years after the war? And in order to answer that question, I had to spend, maybe I could have found shortcuts, but I didn't. I spent 6 to 8 years researching, using sources from Germany and France and the Soviet Union and Israel and the United Kingdom and all over the United States. And I discovered the story of the last million. 250,000 Jews, 400,000 to 500,000 Polish forced laborers and slave laborers who had been brought into Germany to do the work left behind by the German soldiers who were on the Eastern Front, and a couple of 100,000 Baltic citizens, Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, who had come into Germany to flee the Red Army, and many of them because they had been Nazi collaborators. And they thought the only place on earth they would be safe was Germany. This group, the last million, were rounded up by the occupying military after liberation, after VE Day on May 8th. They were sorted out by nationality. There was no, Jews were not recognized as a people. Polish Jews were put with Polish Christians, Lithuanian Jews with Lithuanians. In many times, the Jews found themselves with concentration camp guards, with people whose family members had taken everything they had. So this was the story I told. And this was the story I tried to tell. And I tried to tell the story not only about the tragedy of forcing these people, forcing the Holocaust survivors to spend another 3 to 5 years behind, often behind barbed wire in camps in Germany. It is an unspeakable tragedy, but also talk about the triumph of these remarkable people, the surviving remnant, and how they understood that it was their duty and their privilege to make sure that Hitler would not win, to keep Jewish culture, the Jewish religion, the Jewish people alive in the camps. The camps would serve as a launching pad for a new generation and a rebirth of the Jewish people after the Holocaust.
Well, thank you for putting that in context, and certainly the 6 to 8 years you spent on it was well worth it. So your language and prose in places is so descriptive. So, let's unpack a little who the last million are. You used the phrase, quote, the steamy, abject porridge of human woe, close quote. Obviously, the elderly, the infirm, the lame. And one other quote, which builds off of what you said earlier, quote, the last million is the story of displaced East Europeans who, when the shooting stopped, refused to go home or had no homes to return to. It is the story of their confinement in refugee camps for, as you said a moment ago, for up to 5 years after the war ended. Close quote. You want to expand on that any further beyond what you said earlier?
Yeah, there are 3 major groups of displaced persons. The largest group are the Poles. The German government understood very early. The German government first thought, Hitler believed that the Soviets would surrender, the British would surrender, the war would be over in a matter of months. When it became clear that the fighting on the Eastern Front was going to go on and on and on and on, the Germans had to replace the soldiers who had gone off to war. They needed someone to till the ground, to bring in the crops, to work on the railroads, to work in the factories, to work in the mines and mills. So what did they do? They kidnapped millions of Eastern Europeans, mostly Ukrainians and Poles. At first, they lied to them. They said, come to Germany. It's a wonderful nation. It's the future. Poland is the past. Come, we will give you more money than you've ever seen. You'll eat well, and you'll have enough left over to send home to your family. This is what they told the Poles and the Ukrainians. When it became clear, within months, that the Poles and the Ukrainians were to be treated as Untermenschen, they wrote back to and they got the word out. And from that moment on, the Germans had no choice but to kidnap, literally kidnap young people and bring them to Germany. The second group are the Latvians, the Estonians, the Lithuanians, the non-Jewish Latvians, Estonians, and Lithuanians. The Jewish populations of the Baltic nations had been wiped out, exterminated. Handfuls were left. In 1944, as the war came to a close, thousands of Baltic nationals left because they did not want to live under Soviet domination, number one, but more importantly, because thousands of these people had aided the Nazis. They had done so in large ways, they had done so in small ways. There was an Estonian and a Latvian and a Ukrainian Waffen-SS division.
Right.
There were thousands of auxiliary policemen who found, located, turned over to the Germans, shot and buried Jews in the killing fields. More than half the Jews who died, who are victims of the Holocaust, are not killed by gas. They're killed in the killing fields of Eastern Europe, shot, often by locals under the direction of the Germans. So they streamed into Germany at the end of the war. The last group were the Jews. Hitler and the Nazi high command recognized that as the war was being lost, they could not allow the world to see the crimes against humanity that they had committed. They closed down the death camps and the concentration camps in Poland, and they moved the survivors. We don't know how many there were, maybe 80,000, 90,000. They cleared out Birkenau, they cleared out Auschwitz. They put people, they marched people to train stations, put them into cattle cars, brought them into Germany. And those who survived the death march into Germany, probably half of that total of 80,000, were put to work underground in the factories underground that Hitler hoped would produce the secret weapon. When the war was over, the Allies, the Canadians, the Americans, the British, liberated those camps. And the third group of displaced persons, the Jewish survivors, exited and ended up in displaced persons camp, from concentration camp, from death camp to displaced persons camps.
Absolutely. So you mentioned that I think in the book there were about less than 30,000 German Jews. Overall, your estimate is about 250,000.
Yeah, what happens is, and you know, we forget, or you know, the story of the Holocaust has been told and told and told and told, but there are certain things that we don't entirely understand. All the Baltic Jews were wiped out with very small numbers. If you meet a Litvak, if you meet someone from Lithuania, like my family, you can be pretty damn sure that they came to this country in between 1905 and 1935. Once the Germans took over, the fatality rate was near 100%. So what happens is that when the camps are open, when Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Ohrdruf, Buchenwald are opened up, and the Jews come out, there are only 30,000, 40,000. And those who are able to walk, those who can breathe, the first thing that they do is they try to walk back to Poland to see if anyone has survived. There's no other way to find out if a family member or a loved one has survived than to go back to your hometown. So 10 to 20,000 go back. 80% of the Polish Jews who survive World War II survived because they crossed the border into the Soviet Union. They were not killed during World War II. They suffered at hard labor in the Asiatic reaches in Siberia. They worked hard, they worked long. Large numbers of them survived, many died. When the war was over, they came back to Poland. Stalin provided trains to bring them back into Poland. And when they arrived in Poland, they discovered to their horror that no one
Family
was
was gone.
left. Yeah, and when they went to their former apartments, or when they tried to move into their old houses, they were told by the Poles, who evidenced more anti-Semitism, more virulent, violent anti-Semitism after the war than before. They were told there was no place for a Jew in Poland anymore. We thought you were dead. We don't want you here. So what happens is in 1946, the 30 to 40,000 Jews who were in the camps originally, 1946, they're joined by another 200,000 Polish Jews. And another extraordinary, tragic irony, the only place in the world, the only place in Europe that the Polish Jews felt safe was in Germany, in camps where they would be guarded by American soldiers.
Well said and explained. You obviously adverted to earlier the Nazis, war criminals, as well as Quislings. And I'll give you a quote because this was part of your research too. Quote, among them were thousands who had collaborated with the Nazi occupation forces, served in German organized and commanded Waffen SS units and or committed war crimes would not be publicly revealed, as you say, for another 3 decades. Was this one of the surprises that you encountered in your research, or did you expect this all along?
No, I did not expect it. I did not expect it. I did not expect that when the United States finally opens its doors, and this is a different story that maybe we'll get into later, when the United States finally welcomes displaced persons, it restricts the entrance of Jews and it privileges the entrance of Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, and Ukrainians, among whom were the largest number of war criminals and Nazi collaborators. It is, it is not, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but it's not until the middle 70s where Congresswoman Liz Holtzman and a number of intrepid New York Times reporters discover that among the displaced persons who entered this country after 1948, the INS knew of dozens of war criminals, and it kept it a secret.
Right, we'll certainly get into that. But while we're on the subject of surprises in your research, given your comprehensive work, what else, before we get into other details, surprised you in what you uncovered?
Well, part of what surprised me right in the very beginning is when the camps were liberated, Eisenhower was horrified by what he found at Dachau, at Bergen-Belsen, and Buchenwald. And he contacted Chief of Staff Marshall, who contacted Truman, and they decided to invite key congressmen, senators, publishers, editors of the major newspapers, newsreel companies to come and to do stories about Dachau and Buchenwald, the camps. And there were dozens of such stories. And there were famous radio broadcasts and newsreels. Edward R. Murrow is probably the most famous. But nowhere in any of those are Jews mentioned. Nowhere. The Edward R. Murrow talks about Poles and Russians and French and Yugoslavs. He doesn't mention Jews. Neither do any of the other stories. The Jewish survivors were the forgotten, lost people. The only ones who paid attention to them were this, in Germany, was this remarkable group of Jewish army chaplains from all over the country, Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, who were chaplains in the army and who literally deserted their troops after 1945 and spent full time trying to care for the Jewish survivors and to let their congregations, their local newspapers, their congressmen, and the President of the United States know what had happened, that there were these suffering Jews who were now in camps with non-Jewish Poles or non-Jewish Lithuanians. This surprised me. It surprised me that the Jewish survivors who should have been watched over, cared for, were ignored. They were ignored until the word got to Henry Morgenthau, who was the only Jewish member of Roosevelt's cabinet and Truman's cabinet. And Morgenthau went to the State Department, he went to the White House, and he said, something must be done, please.
It's funny, earlier this week, we did a program on righteous, and we discussed this very thing, the Morgenthau conversation and meeting one-on-one with FDR. And he obviously created the War Refugee Board, which
Yes.
made a big difference. What about the role of the Joint Distribution Committee in this process?
Yeah, in the beginning, the Jewish chaplains were furious and the survivors were furious because they had expected that as soon as they were liberated, the world would not only open its doors for those who wanted to resettle, but would bring food, would bring everything that they needed to survive to them. It didn't happen. And they blamed the Joint for this, but it wasn't the Joint's problem. What happened was the American military was so preoccupied with trying to bring order to Germany, to house and to feed not only the last million displaced persons, but millions of German civilians and returning German soldiers, that they wouldn't let any charitable group into the country. And it was not until the fall, really, that the army allowed the Joint and Highest to come into Germany and to bring supplies, needed supplies, extra rations, food, items needed for prayer services to the camps.
Thank you. Let's talk a little more about, and we'll get into all the issues with Liz Holtzman and others in a few moments, but let's talk a little about life in the DP camps. One quote again from your book at page 546. The plight of the aged DPs was heartrending. No country seemed prepared to give asylum, as you just said, to the aged and helpless, termed in official jargon the hardcore, as you call it, a singularly inept phrase to apply to shaky old women, patients wilting with tuberculosis, and haggard, armless, or legless youths. So speak a little about what life in the camps was like.
The camps were, each of the camps, the Ukrainians, the Latvians, the Poles, and especially the Jews, they realized that these camps were going to be their homes for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And the Jews were absolutely remarkable, especially after, in the beginning, in the camps, the survivors who come out of Dachau and Bergen-Belsen, there are no old people, there are no young people. Everyone is between 30 to 40 because these, or 25 to 40, because these are the only ones who were able to survive the death camps. It is a bizarre and unhealthy community, and everybody knows it. Once the Polish Jews come into the camps, everything changes. And suddenly the sound of children are heard. Baby carriages and tricycles appear. The Jews now, and there are 250,000 of them after 1946, they decide that they are going to recreate somewhere between, a shtetl and, an urban community. And they set up their own synagogues, their own schools, their own theater groups. They published dozens of newspapers and books. They set up historical commissions to track the community that has been lost, the world that has been lost, and to identify those who were responsible for it, the war criminals. In 1948, I've got a picture, a photograph of this in my book. Leonard Bernstein arrives and goes to 2 of the camps and, conducts orchestras that include some of the displaced persons. It is remarkable, absolutely remarkable. But we cannot overlook the heartbreak And we cannot overlook the suffering. And we cannot overlook the damaged, distraught people in the camps who could not get a step beyond mourning their dead. The people in the camps, the Jews in the camps, were frightened. They were frightened that they would have to spend the rest of their lives in Germany. They were frightened that one day the Americans would go home and say, "You're now German citizens. You have to obey the German police. You have to follow the German laws." They were scared to death. Large numbers of them wanted to go to Palestine because they were Zionists. Large numbers of them wanted to go to Palestine because they didn't think there was any place else on earth that they would be welcomed. But the British refused. Truman tried hard to get the British to open the gates of Palestine to Jewish immigration. The British refused over and over and over again. So the Jews were left in limbo. And they were left in limbo as the Latvians, including the war criminals and the Nazi collaborators, were invited to go to Britain and Belgium and Australia and Brazil and Canada. And the Poles were invited to leave the camps and resettle in nations all over the world. Why? Because there was a worldwide labor shortage after World War II. And everybody was wanted except for the Jews, except for the Jews.
But their hopelessness in those camps still bred, as you say, incredible creativity out of those ashes.
Yeah, it's a story of, the story that I tell is a story of extraordinary perseverance, of extraordinary heroism of these people who said to themselves over, you can read the Yiddish newspapers, who say over and over again, we must look forward. We cannot forget the dead, but we have to look forward. It's our responsibility to the dead to revitalize, recreate a thriving Jewish community from the ashes of the Holocaust.
Absolutely. So let's project ahead a little and get to some of the other points you mentioned before we get to audience questions. You write in the book also about the International Rescue Committee, which David Miliband now heads. I want to look forward a little. You have somewhere between 60 and 80 million refugees in the world today, which will only increase due to global climate change and water shortages and beyond. So what are the lessons for today? Let me ask that first.
Okay, the first lesson is, and Franklin Roosevelt knew this in 1943, that the only solution to the refugee problem is an international solution, a global solution. No one nation can act on its own. The nations of the world have to act together. It's number one. Number two, we have to recognize that war breeds violence and suffering, and that violence and suffering continues long after ceasefires, truces, peace treaties. And it is the responsibility of the civilized world to undo as best it can the damage that has been caused by those wars, wars between nations, civil wars, okay? And third, and most importantly, I think the lesson that comes out of the saga of the displaced persons, particularly the Jews, is that a refugee policy has to be founded on a politics of hope and on the best of the American people, or humanitarian instincts, rather than on politics of fear. And it has to be founded on reality, on truth, on facts, rather than falsehoods. Let me explain what I mean. The Jews were barred from this country, while the Latvians and the Estonians and everybody else was allowed in under the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, because it was said, and a majority of Congress agreed with this, that the Jews were security risks. Why? Because they were Polish, they had come out of the Soviet Union, and therefore they were communist dupes or sympathizers or agents. Let me read something. It's just, it's frightening, but I will read it. This is said on the floor of Congress, and no one except Manny Seller of Brooklyn stands up to dispute it. This is by Ed Lee Gossett of Texas. Our camps are literally filled, he's talking about the Jews here, with bums, criminals, subversives, revolutionaries, crackpots, and human wreckage. The DPs awaiting passage to America, he's talking about the Jews, have been schooled in subversive activities and seek entry here to serve foreign ideologies. 50% of them are communists. John Rankin of Mississippi says 90% of the members of the Communist Party in this country are members of racial minority groups. 60% of them are immigrants who come here from Europe and are spending millions of dollars plotting the overthrow of the government. 50% of the, the communists have men here right now in the displaced persons camps preparing to enter the United States as spies. This is nonsense.
We touched on this in advance of this because I have to stop and say this here. The anti-immigrant sentiment, which you well described and certainly existed in Congress, and Tony Blinken spoke about it recently in his own agency, the State Department. That anti-immigrant sentiment also existed earlier during the war. Indeed, as I think I mentioned to you, my own father, saved by Chikuni Sugihara in Lithuania, taken to Japan, sought in 1941 to come to the United States. He could not come in until 1946. He was asked one question, the answer to which, his honest answer, ensured that he wouldn't get in, to your point. And that was, do you have any family still living in war-torn Nazi-occupied Europe? And he said, yes, my sister, who died in Auschwitz, he didn't know that then. His parents, the same. And they said, you can't come to the United States because you could be a Jewish spy for the Nazis. So that sentiment carried on, and you write so profoundly about the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracies later and the threat to the United States. So that is, I think, an important lesson and point. And also, I think I'd like you to comment on this, the juxtaposition between the denial of Jews and other refugees after the war and the admittance of war criminals, because I want to get to the Office of Special Investigations and Liz Holtzman in a minute. But to your point, I just want to add this quote and have you comment from page 510, quote, the cumulative effect of the Displaced Persons Act, McCarran Internal Security Act, and the Act to Clarify was that from late 1948 through the early 1950s, suspected communists were denied visas while untold numbers of anti-Semites, Nazi collaborators, and war criminals gained entrance to the United States. It
is a fact. And, and I show this in my book, that the State Department, the CIA, Army intelligence, any number of agencies were, how can I put it, overlooked, forgot about the Nazi past of these individuals. Why? Because they now declared that they were virulent anti-communists. And as long as you held out your card as an anti-communist in 1947, 1948, 1949, into the McCarthy period. That was collect $200, come into the United States. The CIA employed hundreds of former Nazi collaborators and war criminals. The State Department, Radio Free Europe, any number of organizations. And meanwhile, the Jews were kept out because they were suspected of being communists. There is a threat to the United States of America during the Cold War, but the threat is not, as Arthur Schlesinger and as any number of other historians have said, this threat is not an internal one. The threat is an external one, right? The enemy is the Soviet Union. The enemy are not Jews who are falsely accused of being communist agents or sympathizers. But the big lie because men, there were few women at the time, men in Congress who should have stood up and said, no, this is a lie, did not. The only ones who did were Claude Pepper of Florida and the Jewish congressmen, most of them from New York, though I think Adolph Sabath is from Chicago, and they stood up and they stood strong. And they said, this is a lie. But there were too few of them, and no one listened.
Thank you. Let me go to a quote on Canadians and what they did with refugees for a minute, and then I want to get into the period of 1973 and the beginning of learning of and dealing with war criminals. As I mentioned, current Secretary of State Tony Blinken spoke about for Yom HaShoah several weeks ago the anti-Semitism in his own State Department. The fact is the Canadians' response on refugees was none is too many. So speak to that a minute, elaborate if you would on that.
Yeah, there's this sense. You see, I began our discussion by saying we look to history for warm baths to feel comfortable about our past. And in so doing, we let myth overtake fact and reality. The persecution, the discrimination against Jews, anti-Semitism writ large and small, did not end with Hitler in his bunker. They did not end with the overthrow of the Nazi state. The language changed. The language changed so that the individuals who the individuals in Congress didn't use the same language that Hitler did, but they were anti-Semites nonetheless. And the same in Canada and Australia and Brazil. There's this sense that we have to keep the Jews out. One, the old anti-Semitism, because they're clannish, because they don't work hard, because they're thieves, blah, 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 is wedded to this new strain of anti-Semitism, new in America at least, starting with the war, that the Jews are also subversives. And we've got to keep them out for that. And then there's just the old-fashioned, horrible anti-Semitism. Patton, at one point, General Eisenhower visits a camp, and he goes into a synagogue on Yom Kippur. It is an extraordinary gesture of solidarity with the displaced Jews, the Jewish survivors. And Patton, in his diary, which thank God he didn't have time to destroy before he died. And this is a direct quote from his diary. We entered the synagogue, he's talking about Eisenhower and he. We entered the synagogue, which was packed with the greatest stinking bunch of humanity I have ever seen. The smell was so terrible that I almost fainted, and actually about 3 hours later lost my lunch as a result of remembering it. He goes further. He's talking about those who believe that Jews should receive special treatment because of their unique suffering. He says they believe that the displaced person is a human being, which he is not. And this applies particularly to the Jews who are lower than animals. I mean, these sentiments did not disappear in 1945. Thank God, in the prosperity of the 1950s and the 1960s, for reasons that go beyond the scope of my book, this virulent anti-Semitism was restrained, was restricted, decreased. But from 1945 to 1950, it was not.
So let's look ahead again. You adverted to this earlier. As you and I discussed before this program, there were few heroes or heroines in your book, but one of them is someone who we both know, who's a good friend, I'm privileged to say. I did a program with Elizabeth Holtzman actually in January of 2020, right before the pandemic, on her work in this regard. But she was a newly minted congresswoman, defeated Emanuel Seller, named to the House Judiciary Committee. And I'll let you tell a little of the story. She received a visitor from the Immigration and Naturalization Service who gave her a list of some 53 Nazi war criminals. I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, and the man, we still don't know who, she's never said who the name of this man. She received him very cordially and she said thank you, and she didn't believe it. She didn't, it was, she went to her colleagues,
Right.
who shall not be named, and she said, did you know that this happened? And her colleagues said, no, we never heard of that, it can't be true. I guess about 3-4 months later, there was a oversight hearing of the head of the INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service. And at the end of this long hearing in which they go over budget and plans and agendas and this and that, Holtzman rises, junior member of the committee, and she says, is it true that you have a list of war criminals and Nazi collaborators who came into the country as displaced persons? And to her utter shock, the director of the INS said, yes, we do. And from that moment on, Liz Holtzman was a tiger. You know, I don't know how to describe her. She grabbed hold of this and she did not let go. And she did not let go until, and there were a number of people who just poo-pooed it or who said it's no big deal. She did not let go until a special office, the Office of Special Investigations, was set up in the Justice Department, and its responsibility, its mandate, was to investigate the INS and the State Department and discover whether it was true that war criminals had been allowed into this country and had been kept hidden.
She turned over every rock, and she's a true upstander. That's one of the concepts in our museum of being a proactive, positive force for change. She certainly was, and you well document it. So let me ask one other question before I turn to considerable audience questions. The question is, you speak about the guilt and shame of really two generations. I'll give you a quote here. The last million had carried with them to their new worlds their wounds, their fears, their hatreds, their pasts, and also hopes for a different future. And you also speak about how the children, the second generation, had some guilt and shame. Expand on that a little, if you would.
Yeah, the second generation, and this is a remarkable group of people that includes people like Joe Berger, formerly of the New York Times, and Esther Foer, the mother of the novelist and the writers and Menachem Rosensaft, an extraordinary man who's just an extraordinary. Have you worked with him? Do you know Menachem?
He's actually distantly related.
Ah, okay. Well, these are remarkable people, and their children. They are children who were born in displaced persons camps, and what shames them to some extent was that they never knew what their parents had gone through. Their parents didn't want to talk about the horrors of the Holocaust to their children. They talked about it to the grandchildren.
Right.
And they talked about it as they became much older. There's an extraordinary book by a woman named Mary Fulbrook, a British historian, called Reckonings. And she talks about the difficulty of the survivors. In the beginning, the Holocaust survivors wanted the world to know, and the world didn't listen. And the Holocaust survivors then realized that it was best to keep quiet. And I think the second generation didn't think it did enough. There was also a tremendous responsibility placed on the second generation because they had to redeem the promise that their parents had made to resurrect the Jewish community. And it was up to the second generation to do that. And that's an extraordinary burden to be placed on young people. They grew up with this. They grew up without, when I interviewed a number of them, what they all said was, we grew up without grandparents. We were the only kids on the block who had no grandparents. Their grandparents had perished in the Holocaust. And they didn't understand till many years later what that meant to the first generation.
No question. I can certainly relate to that. So let's get to a few audience questions. The first question, if I may, David, asks about a camp, Feldafing, Feldafingdp camp, which apparently was the first all Jewish displaced persons camp. Is that true?
Yes. Feldafing is the largest camp. And in the beginning, when what happens is that Truman sends a special emissary, Dean Earl Harrison, to investigate what's going on. Harrison comes back to Truman. Truman, to his credit, meets with Harrison, reads his report. Harrison says in his report, we are treating the Jews exactly as the Germans did, except we're not exterminating them. We're putting them behind barbed wire. We're treating them as subjects. So Truman tells Eisenhower, open up. Get the non-Jews out of the camps. Give the Jews their own camps. Allow them to set up their own governments within these camps. Allow them to police these camps and make sure that they get extra rations, that we bring in Yiddish-speaking liaison people. Feldafing is the first camp in which that happens. And Feldafing is it's one of the largest camps. It's the camp with many, many newspapers and publications. It's a camp that has a number of terrific boxers who do very well in the boxing league that's set up among all the Jewish camps in Germany. But it's always beaten by Bergen-Belsen when it comes to the chess tournaments.
Interesting. There's a question about displaced person camps in Austria and Italy. Do you have any experience with those?
Yes, absolutely. There are about 80 to 90% of the displaced persons are in camps in Germany. There is a much smaller number in Austria and a smaller number still in Italy. Jared Kushner's grandparents are in displaced persons camps in Italy. And Ray Kushner, his grandmother, says eloquently, and I quote it in the book, we had to stay in these camps because no one wanted us. There was no place to go. No doors were open to us. So yes, and one of the more remarkable camps which I visited was the old movie studio the great Italian movie studio Cinecittà, where all the great, Italian film spectaculars were filmed prior to the war, and then in the 1950s when the camp was closed down. But again, I have spoken mostly, and I write mostly about the German camps, because there's the most literature and the most displaced persons were in them.
Thank you. Someone is asking about a DP camp in Czechoslovakia, in Cheb, Scheb. Are you familiar with that camp?
Yeah, in a minor way. There were camps in Czechoslovakia. There were camps set up wherever there had been foreigners, refugees, Jews, and there were a lot of Jews in Silesia who were put to work. And when the war was over, they were put into camps in Czechoslovakia. The Czechs were much nicer. And the relationship between the Czech population and the Jewish DPs was stronger than it was certainly in Germany or Austria.
There's a question also about the percentage of non-Jewish groups, the three of them, the Baltics, the Polish, and Russians. What percentage of each of those, in your estimation, were Nazi collaborators of one sort or another? Any sense?
Yeah, the Poles, there were not a lot of Nazi collaborators. And why? Why? Because the Nazis didn't trust the Poles. The Nazis believed that the Poles were Untermenschen. They were one step ahead of the Jews. And the Nazis would not allow any of the Poles to take positions of authority within the occupation governments. The Nazis believed, on the other hand, that the Baltic nations and some of the Ukrainians were, the word was Aryanizable. In other words, that they could be made into Aryans, and therefore you could make them into collaborators, bring them into the occupation governments. There's an extraordinary quote I found in which at one point Hitler is worried because German housewives don't have any help at home. There are no babysitters, there are no nannies, nothing. And he says to his Gauleiter and to his agents in the Ukraine, why don't we begin bringing some Aryanizable Ukrainian girls into Germany, but make sure, look for those who are blonde and blue-eyed and kidnap them, put them on a train and bring them into Germany, and we'll make them nannies. Poles were never regarded in that way.
There's a question also about a camp in Kassel, Germany. Did your research go into that?
Yeah. But again, let me say that, and you'll get information, everyone who's on this talk will get information. If you have particular questions about particular camps, my personal email is going to be made available. And get in touch with me. And I'm happy to answer questions about individual camps.
Absolutely. Someone else is asking about the impact by Primo Levi. If this is a man, do you want to speak to that?
Primo Levi's books are absolutely extraordinary. He was not really a displaced person because when he was liberated from Auschwitz, he was immediately put on a train to bring him home. But he went from Auschwitz into the Soviet Union and then into Italy. His books stand as testimony to the greatness of this individual soul in how there is a goodness, there is a grace, there is a dignity that certain human beings have and to which we should all aspire. This is a heroic story and a very tragic one. And I profited from reading everything that he wrote, as will anyone.
Absolutely. And still very timely today, no question. Let's see here. I think we covered, other than specific camps, we covered most of the questions. So why don't we, in a final wrap up, you're a fount of knowledge on all these issues, and you brought your wonderful book, which I really commend to everyone, alive. You know, what else did we not touch on that in the few minutes we have left, you know, we should expand on or explore?
Yeah, I think that one of the points that I make in this book is that in the end, Truman is faced with a horrible problem. Truman is not an anti-Semite, but he's also not a philo-Semite, despite what some have written about him. And he's certainly not a Zionist. And some of his statements about Jews being too pushy and, you know, seeking his favors, or, you know, they're, what can I say? They're disgusting and nasty. Nonetheless, Truman recognizes that he cannot establish an independent government in Germany until he's gotten the displaced Jews out of Germany. He recognizes that a German state cannot be given control of 250,000 Jews in camps, and the Jews cannot be integrated into German society in 1947 or 1948 or 1949. So in order to establish an independent West Germany, which he has to do to fight the Cold War and is to make the Marshall Plan a reality, he's got to get the Jews out. He tries, but not hard enough, to get them into the United States. When he recognizes that that can't be done, he supports, against his advisors, against the State Department.
Right.
He supports first partition of Palestine into a Jewish area and an Arab area and a small international area around Jerusalem. And then when the attempts at partition fall apart because of Palestinian and Arab intransigence, he and Ben-Gurion declares independence. 3 minutes later, Truman recognizes the state of Israel. Why? I think because it is the only possible way to get the remaining 200,000 Jews out of Germany. In the end, and this is something that shocked me as well, in the end, 55,000 Jews get displaced persons visas to come to the United States. 155,000 to 200,000 have no choice but to go to Israel. Many of those go under duress because they had suffered through a world war and they did not want to suffer through, as much as they supported an independent Jewish homeland, they did not want to live in another world at war, which was Israel in 1948. Many of those who went to Israel would later come to the United States. But the Displaced Persons Acts of 1948 and 1950, only 55,000 Jews were allowed into this country out of a total of 400,000 displaced persons who came to the United States in this period.
Well, on that somber note, I think we'll have to close it. But since there are a few other questions of specific DP camps, and I may have missed it in the chat, you want to, since you kindly and generously offered, give out your, just say your email. So
Absolutely. No, and I'm happy. I've had some wonderful conversations via email with people. DNASAW, DNASAW @gc.cuny.edu.
Yeah, I think it was just put on the screen. That's wonderful. Well, David, I want to thank you Truly, you're a wonderful scholar, an author who brings this tale, important story to life. I commend all of you to get his book if you haven't already. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. I also want to thank Raheem, Kelly, of course, CEO Susan Abrams, and the entire staff of the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center for putting the program on. And I wish all of you safe and fine week ahead. So
Thank you.
thank you again, David, and thank you to the museum.